Hello, and welcome to the Religion 107 podcast with your host, Andre Bankston. Today we will be interviewing Simon Zachary. Simon is one of my old teachers who is a Jesuit in training and is currently studying at the University of Santa Clara and studying theology. At the moment, he is studying abroad in Paris, France, and he is having a wonderful time. So I'm very glad that we could have him on for this interview because I know it took a lot to figure out this time difference. We're going to be talking about religion and globalization, specifically how the Catholic Church has dealt with globalization over the past 40, 50 years. And I will be referencing a few articles that will be attached at the bottom of the video in the link in the bio. And if you'd like to, you can check them out. And that these links were the background for my research and for this interview. So hopefully you enjoy it. I got a lot out of it, and Simon was absolutely fantastic. I can't wait for you to hear it. Let's get into it. Today we have Simon Zachary with us. If you could give us a little background on your education, what you're doing, and where you're at right now, that'd be very helpful.
Hey, sure, I'd be happy to. So I'm a Jesuit in training, a baby Jesuit, as I like to call myself. I'm not a Catholic priest yet, but on my way to getting there. I'm about 9 years in and just have about one more year left. And a little bit of background. Yeah, I ended up majoring in business in undergrad, worked in online advertising for a handful of years. And then when I became a Jesuit, I was really interested in learning more about Catholicism, about our faith, but also learning more about the world around us and really kind of being concerned with well-being in a more general sense, but like how do people who struggle in certain countries around the world, like how do countries move from being really scarce in resources to people being better off and having what they need to live, whole kind of flourishing lives.
Today we will be discussing the Catholic Church's response to globalization over the last few decades. I would like to begin by talking about the recent demographic changes of the Church. A Georgetown think tank called the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate keeps records on the U.S. demographics of the Church. And according to their research, the Catholic clergy and lay people's populations have been dwindling significantly over the last few decades. How do you think globalization has impacted this demographic trend?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would tend to look at Vatican II, at the Second Vatican Council, as kind of a watershed moment in history for impacting that change that you see in the clergy. So that was from 1962 to 1965. And a whole lot of meetings happened. And then as a result, the church came out with a bunch of new documents about its teaching, one of which, maybe one of the more significant documents, sort of altered the theology around what it means to have a vocation, a religious vocation. And so Vatican II teaches that all of us are called to religious vocations, whether you're a lay person, you decide to get married, maybe you decide to stay single, maybe you join religious life to be a priest or a sister. Versus previously, there was an understanding, not held by everyone, but it was the prevailing thought that sort of like the best vocation would be to be a religious sister or a priest or a deacon. And so because that theology changed, we saw a good number of people moving into other vocations, choosing other things for their lives, which of course is is a good thing, that people are more free to see God working through their lives in different ways. I think the other thing that's maybe led to the decline, a few other things I'd point to, just in this era of globalization, um, the exchange of ideas happens more freely, so people learn about other religious traditions. There's a wind of secularism, right? These questions in the modern era of why do I need to be religious? Maybe I find that I'm spiritual and not religious, and so that kind of impacting people's choices, their vocations. And then finally, I'd say I think the last contributing factor, unfortunately, would be the abuse scandal in the church. Just breaks my heart to even mention, but the hundreds of thousands of children, adults, so forth, who have been abused by clergy, and that leading to a crisis of faith. People no longer interested in joining religious life, let alone being religious. Period. There have been, I think, some really positive changes recently in terms of overturning that, just as we've seen with the Me Too movement in secular spaces. But that's, I think, in a nutshell, what's led to the decline.
How do you think that this demographic shift within the United States and other Western countries compares to trends in different parts of the world, such as Africa and Latin America? From my vantage point, this movement away from the Catholic Church seems like a problem of only the developed world, as Catholicism has been growing in developing nations.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I've thought about it before. I don't have a great answer,
Mhm,
but my suspicion is maybe two things that two reasons why you might see a difference in the developing world versus the developed world.
mhm,
Talking about Europe and North America versus the Americas, Africa, Asia, so forth. So the two things maybe I would point to are number one, just a differences, some differences in how those countries have developed. Maybe people have been well off enough in certain countries in Europe and the US and kind of far removed from conflict. And so uh, this sense of like, I don't really need God,
mhm,
potentially, I don't know, but maybe that could be a current um, for some people, who've achieved levels of success. There's not necessarily the threat of war like in their home country, particularly. Um, those things could play a role. I think the other thing, in other countries in Africa and Asia, religiosity is just higher, even outside of Catholicism,
mhm,
right? Islam's a very popular religion. It's a fast growing
mhm,
religion in countries in Asia, especially countries you wouldn't necessarily imagine, like Malaysia or the Philippines even. Um, so religion has an appeal,
mhm.
and Christianity kind of is is one of those options that people consider. But yeah, you are seeing that growth in Asia, and then in Africa and certain countries in Africa, you see that kind of boom too.
I'm glad you brought up the Catholic Church in Asia because I wanted to look at the Korean Catholic Church specifically. In the Journal of Korean Religions, researcher Dennis Kim describes the incredible transformation that has happened within the Korean Catholic Church since Vatican II. Prior to Vatican II, the Korean Church was very small and had to import many of its clergy members from other parts of the world to help spread the religion. Since Vatican II, membership of the clergy has increased by over 17 times its pre Vatican II numbers. Now the country exports clergy members to other countries in Asia, and about 11% of the population in South Korea is Catholic. Kim argues that this happened because of an increased focus on integrating Catholicism into an already present culture and focusing on the localization of, of the religion. How do you think localizing the spread of Christianity has impacted evangelizing efforts around the world?
I think I'm an econ nerd, as you know,
Oh yeah.
and I also want to be an optimist. So I
Hmm.
I think I'd go for option B, that like
Hmm.
globalization has had its really good parts and its not so great parts,
Hmm.
and it's presented many challenges to the church. But I think ultimately it's a good thing for the church. You know, what it has forced the church to do is to nuance its theology a little bit more,
Hmm.
to get outside of this black and white thinking. Because the truth is like that's not what we've believed anyways. But to get people to be really intentional about like, okay, well, what is it that you believe, and how can you be supported through the different seasons of your life, and it's not an automatic thing. It used to be. I mean, even thinking back to what I've heard about the church in the U.S. in the 1940s and 50s, it was like kind of unquestionable not to be Catholic if you came from a Catholic family or so forth. And now it's totally the opposite. You're seeing people who are raised that way and shy away. But what we have the opportunity to do is to make free choices now. And I think um, knowing how much like our God respects our personal freedom, like I think that's actually really good.
Hmm.
That like maybe that means that our numbers are smaller, but it also means that people who do identify as Catholic or who are practicing, like they're not just doing it because uh, that's what you do. Like there's been a real choice there.
If I may, Simon, I'd like to shift gears here and look a little bit at how the Catholic Church has handled globalization as a whole. Obviously, in places like Korea, it has thrived, but less so in Europe and North America. Sebastian Kott of the Czestochowa University of Technology in Poland published a paper describing how the church has grown because of globalization, but also how globalization has hindered its growth in other areas. How do you think the innovations and interconnectedness that comes with globalization has helped or hurt the spread of the Catholic Church?
I think it is true. I think that globalization has helped us in many ways. It's made communication faster.
Yeah.
It's opened up opportunities for us. We learn about different parts of the world much more easily than we ever could. You have
Mhm.
the availability of any product pretty much at any time.
Yeah.
Uh, to be able to try different food, to be able to travel anywhere in the world really easily.
Mhm.
Like those are all definitely pros. But yeah, a sense of identity. There could be that, and I wonder. It's interesting to look at the different ways that like that might be manifest. Like,
Mhm.
do you see that maybe in far right movements
Mhm.
in the Western countries, maybe even far right movements in developing countries, but like this idea of this is our country, this is who we are as people, and what about us? In the U.S., we're a country of immigrants, but kind of the backlash of what about those who I, it's hard even to distinguish among immigrants, but maybe the white nationalist movement might say, well,
Mhm.
what about those who immigrated previously prior to
Yeah.
a certain era? How does that play out in religion, or
Mhm.
how can Catholicism? I mean, I think that's another really important and separate question. Like, how can Catholicism adapt and give people an identity? I think in the face of globalization, and maybe from the past 2 decades, um, here I am giving you lists again, but I would say two primary responses
Mhm.
that I think we can observe in the Catholic Church, or I think we have observed in the Catholic Church in the wake of globalization, is number one, and these aren't always mutually exclusive, but
Yeah.
more often than not, I'd say yes.
Mhm.
I think one movement within Catholicism is like uh, maybe a traditionalist sort of mindset.
Yeah.
We've got to have
Mhm.
Latin. What am I saying? We have to have Latin, Latin. this must be my French coming out.
It might
I
be.
can't string together sentences in English anymore, so forgive me. Um, Going back to the Latin Mass, embracing these older kind of traditions, maybe seeing tradition as something that's really comfortable
Mhm,
in the face of a world that's rapidly changing.
mhm,
Technology all around us. The world looks different today in 2022 than it did even 10 years ago.
mhm,
Uh, so maybe that's one sort of wave. I think the other wave in Catholicism, we can look to Pope Francis as a model. We can look to even Vatican II, other popes, Pope Paul the Sixth, and so forth, who, part of Vatican II said, "Hey, interreligious dialogue is super important. We need to understand the world around us. We need to listen, and maybe we'll." In addition to learning about one another, maybe we'll find out some commonalities in our faith. That's something, and also, recovering the Gospels and looking at the four Gospels with a more like historical approach. That's something that's
mhm,
newer, that we've only been doing. Theologians have only been doing that for the past 100 years, I'd say, like digging deeper into the history as a way of understanding Jesus's socio-political context that he operated under, and kind of what all of that meant as a way of identifying with whichever people
yeah,
in whichever local church you're talking about. So I think it's kind of going back full circle to the example you talked about
yeah,
in South Korea. Like
mhm,
maybe that is one model about like keeping it relevant. I would say, just to come up with a short statement, keeping it relevant.
yeah. So in 1996, the USCCB came out with goals for how the church in the United States should respond to a more globalized world. This included a focus on healthy labor relations, increased international aid, and building sustainable economic growth with a focus on environmental conservation. How do you think the church in the United States has lived up to these goals, and do you think that these were the right goals that the church should have focused on?
It's a really good question. Those priorities that you list, I think have changed a little bit. Pope Francis came
Yeah,
out with, the Millennium Development Goals that the UN came out with.
yeah,
He sort of came out with his own list, which kind of coincides. Like there's a lot of overlap, but
mhm,
there's new stuff too. Basically, the mindset, and I think Pope Francis as the leader of the church
mhm,
can speak for it, but the mindset is focusing on the most vulnerable in the world. Who There are some winners within the sphere of globalization, and certainly there are those who have been left behind, or for
mhm,
whom like globalization has been a challenge. So how do we lift up immigration as a right, and you can find it in a lot of exhortations and letters that have been written by popes. But how do we sort of ensure that people have the right to immigrate if their lives are at stake, if they're
yeah,
fleeing violence in their home country, uncertain situations, care for the environment, access to clean water,
mhm.
like these are things uh, that Pope Francis and others believe that the church ought to be a force for good, to make sure that human flourishing is possible.
I'm glad you wanted to talk about the church's transition from the mid 1990s and the USCCB declaration to the church's present form with Pope Francis at its head. Specifically, I wanted to ask you about how Pope Francis's Laudato Si impacted the world in a tangible way, because clearly it shook up the religious and even the secular world, but I wanted to get your perspective on how you saw this change in a tangible manner. And this was a foundational moment for the papacy because no pope before Francis had advocated so strongly for the environment. So, what were some of those impacts of Laudato Si that you noticed?
Another really good question. I would say the initial reaction was all over the place
Mm-hmm.
between people within Catholicism, but also Protestants. There there are some Protestant churches that care very deeply for the environment and see it as a priority. There are other mindsets that can be kind of skeptical of this. Like, is this just some new thing that people are worried about that isn't cause for concern? You can hear the refrain sometimes, like people will quote the Old Testament, I think Genesis, like, um, hey, man should have dominion over like the birds and
Mhm.
blah blah blah. Like, why do we have to care for the environment? And then putting that up against, like, well, what do climate scientists say, and like what is the reality around us? So I would say by and large, I think the reaction has been positive.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, and understandably, the Catholic Church does not have representation within the U.S. Congress, within the UN, within the EU, within a lot of these different political spaces. But I wanted to ask you if you think that Laudato Si has actually changed the heart and minds of people within these countries, within the U.S., South America, within Africa, within Europe, um, because it was so foundational and a big change to what the church has been doing.
yeah, um, I hope so. It might be interesting, and I don't have these kinds of numbers off the top of my head, but it might be interesting to just look at like a Pew Research study, like what percentage of Catholics in the US see
Mhm.
environmental concerns as very important to them. And if you could do like a longitudinal study, like comparing, if you wanted to really nerd out, like, oh cool,
But I love
what
the two.
percentage of Catholics think this now in 2022 versus,
Mhm.
I think Laudato Si came out in 2013, 2014. You
Yeah,
might know the year better than
yeah.
I would, but like, has there been a before and after kind of difference? But
Mhm.
it's a fascinating question, and I hope that the answer has been yes. There's been some movement. Um, I hope also that like news reports have helped kind of raise awareness. Unfortunately, but we've seen massive forest fires
Yeah.
in this country. We've seen huge hurricanes. Seems as though hurricane season gets worse and worse each
Mhm.
year. Uh, Sort of this all this evidence that, hey, we've got to act now. Like, the circumstances are pretty dire.
So, as we talked about throughout this conversation, I think we're really hitting hard on the idea of localization versus globalization in the Catholic Church. And I wanted to look at Laudato Si because it was such a globalized effort where it was the Pope sort of speaking out to the Catholic world. However, Pope Francis has also tried localized efforts and given a lot of power to different parts of the church so that they can have their own local flavors and build communities that way. How do you think Pope Francis has handled the dichotomy between a globalized Catholic religion and a localized church?
I think Pope Francis strikes me as somebody who is really, really well read and is aware of the context that unfold in one country to another. I think of him, meeting with different leaders of different religious traditions and trying to build bridges. He met with the Patriarch of Egypt a handful of years ago to try to promote peace. It's a very kind of local sort of context, right?
Yeah.
Like, what makes sense in terms of relations in that country, we would say are specific to Egypt and not necessarily other places. Just the other day, I think he walked down to the embassy. You may have heard
Mhm.
about this, but like in Rome, he walked down to the Russian embassy to get a meeting with somebody to express his concern about the violence in
Mhm.
Ukraine. That's another kind of very prescriptive, like specific solution to one country. So I think you're seeing that. And the principle, this is like nerd theologian speak, I
Mhm.
guess, but
Yeah.
there's a principle of subsidiarity that maybe you've come across, and you can find that in papal exhortations in all these letters written by popes for the past few decades. Basically, the idea is subsidiarity says anything that can be handled locally within the church or by leaders should be handled locally, and anything that needs like more help than that, like absolutely could be handled more globally, but basically like empowers people to try to do as much as they can locally. Now that said, I mean there is a framework that you operate under. It's not like the larger global context isn't still considered, but
Yeah.
just giving people some power.
Like it's trying to balance the idea of having this Catholic framework, but then being able to mold it into your own culturally specific. Is that right? Maybe I'm misphrasing.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, on the one hand,
Mhm.
it wouldn't be like in a local context, one church might say, look, we're going to fundamentally alter like everything that like the Catholic Church says. No, there are still, we've got the catechism, we have teachings from the magisterium from various popes throughout the millennia that like we still hold to, but it just says, hey, given our local context, maybe certain things make more sense. For example, in an American context, um, there's of course we're seeing a shortage of clergy, and some bishops I think wrote a letter to say it's okay every once in a while for lay people to preach at a mass, for an example.
Mhm.
As an example, that's one way of adapting to, hey, what are the circumstances in this particular place.
Obviously, the Pope and the Church at large have tried their best to keep up with the changing times. However, despite these efforts, it still seems like the Catholic Church is always 2 or 3 steps behind the game. With that being said, do you think the Church has done?
That's I mean I think in many ways what you're asking, Andre, is like that's the question in education. No, really, I mean
Yeah.
it's so it's good that that's surfacing on your mind.
Mhm.
Yeah, frankly, like between you and me, I'd like to see more change happening and more swiftly. Like one example of that, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that women were deacons in the early church, that like
Yeah.
women were able to serve as deacons. And then uh, I think by the year 400 or 500, I'm forgetting my
Mhm.
exact dates, but there was a reversal in that. And ever since, women have not been able to participate in that office, uh,
Yeah.
serving as deacons. There's been there's a synod that's happening right now,
Yeah.
which is like gathering. You probably heard about it.
Mhm.
Gathering opinions of Catholics around the world. One of the reasons I think,
Mhm.
from my own perspective, that hasn't changed more quickly, like I mean, from a Western context,
Mhm.
we might say, yeah, that seems like a no-brainer. Like, why not women as deacons, and even more, like, shouldn't women have full participation in the church? Part of it is that any decision like that would have to be a global decision. Like that would be an example of a decision that wouldn't just impact one city, one diocese, or one state. Even like that would be a universal change. And these questions of I live with Jesuits who come from certain countries in Africa, and I've sort of asked them, like, how would that be received in your home country if women were ordained as deacons? And there are just all these cultural things to speak of. So how does it's this kind of paradox that's woven into the church. Like how does the church act locally, but also respect like the diversity of thought that exists globally, even within the Catholic Church,
Yeah.
you know?
It seems like Pope Francis has been more so at least understand the dichotomy between that and that
Yeah.
paradox, with Laudato Si and with him reaching out to other countries and doing what you said, like going to the Ukraine embassy and and focusing on how we can integrate people in the church and care and love and respect rather than being almost a paternalistic figure within the church. Do you
Sure.
agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's very much his style. And it isn't easy. I mean,
Yeah.
I think Pope Francis has been celebrated the things he has accomplished, but he gets criticism from both sides, or from every angle. Some people say he hasn't done enough, like he needs to push for more change, and to be more aggressive in that sense. Others like say, I mean, you even have some who say like, oh, Pope Francis is doing too much and he disregards the traditional church, and he's
Yeah.
not respecting these traditions that have existed for a while. So it's I think a really challenging situation that he finds himself in. But I also think, yeah, as you say, like he's handling this with a lot of finesse and a lot of grace.
So as we look forward, how do you think the church should approach globalization in the next coming years? We've seen a pandemic sort of take away some of the day to day pleasures of what it's like to be a part of the church, and the rise of globalization has created very many difficulties for the church to grow and expand, but it's also given us a lot to think about. So, how do you think in these next few decades the church should respond to a more globalized economy, more globalized world, and a community that spans the globe?
No, if I had the perfect answer to that, then
You'd be the Pope, right?
no, and heaven forbid, that would be dangerous for us all. Definitely. I think, yeah, I think part of it is exploring what would change look like. I think the synod that we're having right now is a really good thing, and probably long overdue, but yeah, really hearing from people. We've been saying since Vatican II that like the church is made up of all believers, right? Of the laity, and let's take that seriously, and actually listen to people and what's moving in their hearts, because God is working through all of us. I'd say that's one thing. The other thing, yeah, in the wake of the pandemic, um, we've seen this previously, and it's kind of ongoing with as we have these new strains come up, that
Mhm.
people continue to isolate. It's not always safe to be in larger crowds, and so don't know where that's going. I'm hopeful that with the vaccines, with each strain seeming to be less and less severe, that like slowly we'll find ourselves out of this pandemic. But I think one of the things that the church does well is like provides people with a strong sense of community at its best. People who may belong to one parish or have been part of a parish for a long time might say like, yeah, this is my home, and these people, like, they're like my extended family. We don't just go to church together, but like they come over to our house all the time for dinner, or like we babysit their kids, or they come over. These kinds of things, like doing more of that, and finding new and creative ways to like build that community. I think that's how people experience their faith most intensely. And I think there's room to grow there. So how does that take shape in a specific parish with like other services that are offered, and opportunities for fellowship? That's one thing. Maybe looking at our Catholic schools, I think of your alma mater, Brophy. I, people talk about the Brophy Brotherhood, right? But like,
Yeah.
is that something? Is there something about like the religious tradition that encourages people to have community, to get together with one another, and in a deep kind of way, like when you share a friendship, it's rooted in a deep care for one another. It's
Mhm.
rooted in faith. It's rooted in more than just superficial level stuff. And so um, how can schools, how can other sort of like social networks that happen to be affiliated with the Catholic Church promote more of that? I think that's the best way to move forward.
So, as you talk about community and the potential that places like our Catholic schools and our parishes can can build upon, I wanted to talk a little bit about how the working class Catholics have stopped going to church as much. And in an article in America Magazine, Kevin Clark argues that it's really hard for Americans, working class Americans, to go to church every Sunday when you're working over 40 hours a week and you're just trying to put food on the table. When you get a few, maybe a day off, maybe a few extra minutes, it's hard to go to church on Sunday, and that's the group that seems to be getting left behind. How do you think that sort of played out within the United States?
That's something that I've heard said before also, that like that's the maybe the most challenging demographic for the Catholic Church to try to improve its relationship with it, which is a shame because that's a um, Jesus was really close to people who suffered, and we're seeing with the middle class or with working class Americans that life life is really hard, and sometimes it can be really challenging to carve out like an hour out of your Sunday when maybe that's your one day off, or maybe you actually work Sundays, or maybe you have a million other things that you have to get to. So I I think I think those concerns are really valid. I wonder also if it comes back to programming being kind of creative within a
Mhm.
parish context. So
Yeah.
is there a way of getting people together throughout the weekdays that like doesn't require a lot of time
Mhm.
and like meets people where they're at? Maybe like it's a face sharing group for adults who are overworked
Mhm.
and like have really significant financial challenges to be able to just support one another in a religious context. Just kind of creative ways that respect the reality of what people are going through.
Yeah. And my last question for you is about how the Catholic Church has handled globalization. After discussing how globalization and localization has impacted the Catholic Church, do you think that globalization has overall been a good thing for the Catholic Church? And has it created the church that, the more perfect church that uh, Catholics strive to become, that the church is trying to become its most idyllic form?
I think I'm an econ nerd, as you know,
Oh yeah.
and I also want to be an optimist. So I
Hmm.
I think I'd go for option B, that like
Hmm.
globalization has had its really good parts and its not so great parts,
Hmm.
and it's presented many challenges to the church. But I think ultimately it's a good thing for the church. You know, what it has forced the church to do is to nuance its theology a little bit more,
Hmm.
to get outside of this black and white thinking. Because the truth is like that's not what we've believed anyways. But to get people to be really intentional about like, okay, well, what is it that you believe, and how can you be supported through the different seasons of your life, and it's not an automatic thing. It used to be. I mean, even thinking back to what I've heard about the church in the U.S. in the 1940s and 50s, it was like kind of unquestionable not to be Catholic if you came from a Catholic family or so forth. And now it's totally the opposite.
That was a fantastic answer, and I'm glad we could leave this conversation on such an optimistic note, because in many ways, this is a really difficult topic to discuss, and it brings in a lot of emotions and a lot of different ideas clashing against one another. So I'm glad that your answer was so optimistic and that we get to share in a more idyllic Catholic Church where people actually can embrace the church for what it is and what they believe in, rather than doing something because it's what you're supposed to do. You know. Well, Simon, I thank you so much for being on this podcast, and you have done a fantastic job. I hope to talk to you very soon. And thank you so much for listening, who's ever listening out there. You guys are great. And this is Andre Bankston and Simon Zachary signing off. I'll talk to you later.